Some folks believe money can buy happiness, but Silas McGraw knew better. He'd traded his heart for an empire and lived to regret it. Every night, the wealthiest man in Redemption Ridge sat alone in his grand house, surrounded by riches but starved for the one thing his fortune couldn't purchase. His friends at the local saloon had watched him grow more distant with each passing year. They decided to set him up with a woman named Annabelle, a piano teacher who'd recently lost her sight in a terrible fire. What started as their friend's simple matchmaking scheme turned into something none of them expected. When Silas walked into that saloon and saw Annabelle sitting quietly at the corner table, he had no idea his life was about to change forever. What happened next left everyone in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in Silas McGraw's study chimed 6 in the morning, same as it had every day for the past 15 years. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a steaming cup of black coffee growing cold at his elbow, while he reviewed land acquisition papers that would expand his cattle empire by another 1,000 acres. At 62, Silas had built something remarkable, a ranch operation that stretched across 3 counties, employing over 200 men and generating more wealth than most small towns ever saw. But wealth, he'd learned, made for poor conversation at breakfast. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs that had cost more than most folks made in a year. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had already come and gone, leaving behind the scent of lemon oil and the quiet that seemed to follow her everywhere. She'd worked for him for a decade, yet their conversations rarely extended beyond discussions of meals and household repairs. Professional courtesy, nothing more. Silas pulled out his father's pocket watch, a tarnished gold timepiece that had belonged to 3 generations of McGraw men. The inscription on the back read, "Time spent with loved ones is never wasted." His father had carried it through 2 wars and 40 years of marriage. Silas had carried it through 40 years of making money and exactly 0 years of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. He flipped open the watch face and stared at the Roman numerals. 6:15. In 30 minutes, he'd ride out to check the eastern pastures, then review the quarterly reports, then meet with his foreman about the new bulls they'd imported from Texas. By evening, he'd return to this same desk, this same silence, this same hollow routine that had defined his life since he'd buried his last living relative 10 years ago. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel drew his attention to the window. 3 riders approached Murphy's boys, coming to collect the monthly payment for grain supplies. Silas recognized them even at a distance, young men with calloused hands and respectful nods, the kind who called him Mr. McGraw, and never quite met his eyes when they spoke. He commanded respect, certainly, but respect wasn't the same as companionship. 30 miles away, in the heart of Redemption Ridge, Murphy's saloon was already alive with the morning crowd. The establishment served double-duty saloon by night, general store, and meeting place by day. Murphy himself, a barrel-chested Irishman with silver whiskers and knowing eyes, wiped down glasses while keeping one ear on the conversation unfolding at his favorite corner table. "The man's turning into a ghost," said Jake Martinez, a weathered ranch hand who'd known Silas since they were both young and foolish. Jake's hands bore the scars of 30 years working cattle, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough of life to speak plainly. Used to be, he'd come in here Friday nights, play poker, tell stories. Now, haven't seen him in 3 months. Old Pete, whose real name nobody remembered and whose age nobody could accurately guess, nodded sagely from behind a checkers board. Pete had the distinction of being the oldest resident of Redemption Ridge, a man who claimed to remember when the town was just 3 buildings and a water well. His white beard reached nearly to his belt, and his blue eyes still sparkled with mischief despite 8 decades of living. "Boys forgotten how to be human," Pete said, moving a checker piece with deliberate precision. "All work and no play makes for a mighty lonely existence." Murphy set down his towel and joined the conversation, as he had a habit of doing when matters of the heart were discussed. "Silas McGraw is the finest man I know," he said, his Irish accent still thick after 40 years in Texas. "Honest as the day is long, generous to a fault, and carries the weight of that ranch like Atlas carrying the world. But he's forgotten something important." Jake asked. "That money's just paper, unless you've got someone to share the life it buys." The three men sat in comfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts about their friend. They'd watched Silas transform from an ambitious young rancher with dreams of prosperity into exactly what he'd set out to become, and somehow lose himself in the process. Success had come at a price none of them had anticipated. "There's got to be something we can do," Jake said finally. "Man deserves better than dying alone in that big house of his." Murphy's eyes lit up, with the spark of an idea forming. "You know what he needs?" "What's that?" "A woman," Pete snorted. "Hell, Murphy, we all know that. Problem is finding one crazy enough to take on a stubborn old bull like Silas." But Murphy was already shaking his head, his mind working through possibilities. "Not just any woman, someone special, someone who could see past all that money and land to the man underneath." "Good luck with that," Jake muttered. "Half the eligible women in 3 counties have thrown themselves at him over the years. He doesn't seem interested." "That's because they were after his wallet, not his heart," Murphy said. "What Silas needs is a woman who doesn't give a damn about his money. Someone who'd love him if he was poor as dirt." The conversation might have ended there, relegated to wishful thinking and good intentions, if not for what happened next. The saloon door opened with a soft chime, and Mrs. Sarah Whitman entered, guiding a woman by the arm with gentle care. The stranger moved cautiously but with dignity, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Whitman's elbow as they navigated between tables. "That's Annabelle Carson," Murphy whispered to his companions. "Piano teacher from over in Millfield. Lost her sight in that terrible fire last month." The 3 men watched as Mrs. Whitman helped Annabelle to a chair near the window where the morning light could warm her face, even if she couldn't see it. Annabelle appeared to be in her late 40s, with auburn hair touched by silver and hands that moved with the graceful precision of someone who'd spent decades coaxing music from piano keys. She wore a simple blue dress, well made but not expensive, and carried herself with a quiet strength that spoke of someone learning to navigate a world suddenly gone dark. "She's staying with the Whitmans until she can figure out what comes next," Murphy continued, his voice soft with sympathy. "Lost everything in that fire, her house, her piano, her livelihood. But listen to this, she's not looking for charity." Asked Mrs. Whitman if there was any work she could do to earn her keep. "Teaching children their letters, mending clothes, anything useful." Pete's weathered face creased into a smile. "Now there's a woman with backbone. More than backbone," Jake observed, watching as Annabelle thanked Mrs. Whitman and began to carefully explore the space around her chair, learning the layout through touch. "Look how she's handling herself. No self-pity, no asking for special treatment, just figuring out how to move forward." Murphy's idea crystallized into something approaching a plan. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "I believe we may have found our answer." "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, though the glint in Murphy's eye suggested he already suspected. "I'm thinking," Murphy said, moving to pour 3 glasses of his finest whiskey despite the early hour, "that it's time we played matchmaker." Pete raised an eyebrow. "You want to set up Silas McGraw with a woman he's never met?" "A blind woman who's lost everything," Jake added, sounding skeptical. "A strong woman," Murphy corrected, "who doesn't need his money and can't be dazzled by his success. A woman who might actually see the man instead of the millionaire." The 3 friends considered this in silence, each imagining how such a meeting might unfold. It was audacious, certainly. It could backfire spectacularly. But as they watched Annabelle Carson navigate her new reality with grace and determination, they began to see the wisdom in Murphy's thinking. "How would we even arrange such a thing?" Jake asked. Murphy's grin widened. "Leave that to me, boys. Leave that to me. Across the room, Annabelle sat quietly by the window, unaware that her life was about to intersect with that of a lonely cattle baron in ways that would surprise them all. She carried in her pocket a small collection of piano keys, the only things she'd managed to save from the fire, charred black, but still smooth to the touch. They reminded her of the music she'd lost, yes, but also of the music that might still be possible in whatever life lay ahead. Neither Silas McGraw nor Annabelle Carson had any idea that three well-meaning friends were about to set in motion events that would change everything. The pocket watch in Silas's vest continued its steady tick, marking time that might finally be spent on something more meaningful than cattle and land deeds. The piano keys in Annabelle's pocket waited silently for the possibility of music again. And in Murphy's saloon, three friends began to plan what they hoped would be the most important introduction of their lives. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Murphy's youngest son, with instructions to wait for a response. Silas found the boy standing respectfully by the front gate, hat in hand, looking as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "Mr. McGraw, sir," the boy stammered. "Pa asked me to give you this and wait to see if you wanted to send anything back." Silas accepted the envelope, noting Murphy's careful penmanship on the front. Inside, he found a message that was both simple and impossible to ignore. *Silas, we need to talk. Important matter regarding someone who could use a friend. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. My place. Come alone and trust us on this one. Your friends Murphy, Jake and Pete, *P.S. Wear something nice. This isn't about cattle. Silas read the note twice, trying to decipher what his friends might be planning. In all their years of friendship, they'd never been cryptic about their intentions. If they wanted to play poker, they said so. If they needed help with a problem, they asked directly. This mysterious summons suggested something entirely different. "Tell your father I'll be there," Silas said to the boy, who nodded and rode off with obvious relief. For the next 2 days, Silas found himself distracted by curiosity. He went through his usual routines, checking cattle, reviewing accounts, meeting with his foreman, but his mind kept returning to that letter. What kind of important matter required him to dress nicely and come alone? And who was this someone who could use a friend? Thursday evening found him standing outside Murphy's saloon at precisely 7 o'clock, wearing his best suit and feeling foolish about it. The establishment looked different in the early evening light, more intimate somehow, with warm yellow light spilling from the windows and the sound of quiet conversation drifting through the door. Murphy greeted him with a broad smile and what appeared to be nervous energy. "Silas, right on time, as always. Come in, come in." Inside, Silas noticed immediately that the usual evening crowd was absent. Only a handful of tables were occupied, and those by people he recognized as Murphy's most trusted friends. In the corner by the window sat a woman he didn't recognize, her back to the door, auburn hair catching the lamplight. "Before you say anything," Murphy said quickly, steering Silas toward the bar, "hear me out. We've been friends for 20 years, and in all that time, have I ever steered you wrong? That depends on how you define wrong," Silas replied dryly, remembering a few questionable adventures from their younger days. "Fair point," Murphy conceded, "but this is different. This is about something more important than money or business or any of the things that usually occupy your time." Jake and Pete materialized at Silas's elbows, effectively boxing him in before he could protest or retreat. Both men wore their Sunday best and expressions of determined goodwill. "Now, don't go getting your hackles up," Pete said in his gravelly voice. "We've got someone we'd like you to meet." "Someone special," Jake added. Silas felt the familiar tension that came with being maneuvered into situations he hadn't chosen. "Gentlemen, if this is what I think it is—" "It's not what you think," Murphy interrupted. "At least, not entirely. Just trust us for one evening, one conversation. If you're not glad we did this, I'll buy your drinks for the next year." Despite his resistance, Silas found himself curious about the woman by the window. There was something about her posture, straight-backed but not rigid, alert but peaceful, that suggested someone comfortable with solitude but not defeated by it. "Her name is Annabelle Carson," Murphy said quietly. "She's been through a difficult time recently, and we thought maybe you two might find something to talk about." Before Silas could object further, Murphy was guiding him across the room. The woman turned as they approached, and Silas felt his prepared protestations die in his throat. Annabelle Carson had kind eyes in a face marked by recent hardship, and when she smiled in greeting, it was genuine rather than calculated. "Mrs. Carson," Murphy said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Silas McGraw. Silas, this is Annabelle." Annabelle extended her hand with careful precision. "Mr. McGraw, it's a pleasure. I should mention that I can't see you, but Murphy has told me you're a gentleman, and his voice suggests he's telling the truth." The directness of her statement caught Silas off guard. No coy pretense, no dramatic revelation, just a simple statement of fact delivered with quiet humor. He took her hand briefly, noting the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "Mrs. Carson," he said, then paused, unsure how to proceed. "I hope you'll forgive my friends. They sometimes act with more enthusiasm than wisdom." "Oh, I'm quite aware this is a setup," Annabelle replied, amusement coloring her voice. "Mrs. Whitman warned me that Murphy had been asking pointed questions about my situation. I agreed to come because I was curious about what sort of man inspires such loyalty in his friends." "And what have you concluded? That you're uncomfortable with the whole arrangement but too polite to simply walk away?" She tilted her head slightly. "Am I wrong?" Silas found himself almost smiling. "You're not wrong." Murphy had been hovering nearby, and now he pulled out a chair for Silas before retreating to what he probably thought was a discreet distance. Jake and Pete positioned themselves at the bar, making it clear they intended to monitor the proceedings. "Your friends seem quite invested in this meeting," Annabelle observed. "They mean well," Silas said, settling into the chair across from her. "Though I suspect they've been reading too many romantic novels." "Do you read romantic novels, Mr. McGraw?" The question was asked with such innocent curiosity that Silas couldn't tell if she was teasing him. "I read cattle breeding journals and financial reports, hardly the stuff of romance." "Pity," Annabelle said. "I used to read everything I could get my hands on. Poetry, novels, newspapers, even the labels on medicine bottles when I was truly desperate. Now I'm learning that listening can be just as revealing as reading, sometimes more so." "What do you mean?" "People's voices tell stories their words don't. Take your friends, for instance. When Murphy talks about you, his voice gets protective, almost paternal. Jake sounds worried when he mentions your name, like a brother concerned about family. And Pete, well, Pete sounds like he's watching a good friend waste his life and wants to shake some sense into him." Silas looked over at his three conspirators, who were making elaborate efforts to appear busy while obviously eavesdropping on every word. "You gathered all that from a brief conversation?" "I've had to develop new ways of understanding the world around me," Annabelle said simply. "When you can't see faces, you learn to read voices, postures, the spaces between words. Your voice, for instance, suggests a man who's forgotten how to have conversations that aren't about business." "And what makes you think that?" "Because you haven't asked me a single personal question since we sat down. You're being perfectly polite, but you're treating this like a business meeting with someone you'll never see again." The observation stung because it was accurate. Silas realized he had been approaching the conversation exactly as she described, formal, careful, keeping appropriate distance. When had he become so guarded that basic human curiosity felt risky? "You're right," he admitted. "I've gotten out of practice with this sort of thing." "What sort of thing?" "Talking to someone just for the pleasure of talking." Annabelle's smile softened. "Well then, perhaps we could practice together." I'm rather out of practice with conversation myself. Since the fire, I've mostly been learning how to navigate daily tasks without sight. It's been weeks since I've had a conversation that wasn't about practical matters. The fire, Silas said carefully. Your friends mentioned you'd been through a difficult time. I lost my home, my piano, and my sight all in one night, Annabelle said with matter-of-fact calmness that somehow made the tragedy more poignant than any dramatics would have. It was quite a lot to process all at once. I'm sorry, Silas said, and meant it. That must have been devastating? Yes, it was, but not final. I'm learning that losing something doesn't necessarily mean it's gone forever. Sometimes it just means you have to find new ways to create what you've lost. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. From it she withdrew several piano keys, their ivory surfaces blackened by smoke but still smooth to the touch. These are all I managed to save, she said, running her fingers over the keys with gentle reverence. They can't make music anymore, but they remind me that music exists independently of the instruments that create it. I can still hear melodies in my mind. I can still teach children to sing. The fire took my piano, but it couldn't take the music itself. Silas found himself genuinely moved by her philosophy. Here was a woman who had lost nearly everything, yet spoke of hope and possibility rather than bitterness and despair. It was a perspective he found both foreign and deeply appealing. You teach music? He asked. I did. I'm hoping to again. Once I figure out how, children don't need to see music to learn it, and I don't need to see them to share what I know. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas found himself genuinely curious about another person's dreams and plans. What will you do in the meantime? Learn. Adapt. Try not to be a burden to the Whitmans while I sort out my future. Annabelle tucked the piano keys back into their bag. And apparently, have conversations with mysterious cattle barons that my well-meaning friends arrange. I hope it's not too disappointing. On the contrary, Mr. McGraw, this has been the most interesting conversation I've had in weeks. As if responding to some invisible signal, Murphy appeared at their table with 2 cups of coffee and a look of hopeful inquiry. Everything going well here? Murphy, Silas said dryly, your subtlety needs work. Never claimed to be subtle, Murphy replied cheerfully. Claimed to be helpful. Big difference. Despite himself, Silas found he was reluctant to end the conversation. Annabelle Carson was nothing like what he'd expected from his friend's matchmaking scheme. She was intelligent, resilient, and possessed of a perspective that made him question his own assumptions about loss and recovery. Mrs. Carson, he said, would you be interested in continuing this conversation, perhaps over dinner sometime? Annabelle's surprised smile was answer enough. Their first dinner took place 3 days later at the Redemption Ridge Hotel, the finest establishment in town, though admittedly that wasn't saying much. Silas had arrived early, choosing a corner table that offered privacy while still maintaining the respectability that small-town propriety demanded. He found himself adjusting his collar and checking his pocket watch more often than necessary, a nervous energy he hadn't felt in decades. When Annabelle arrived, guided by Mrs. Whitman, who departed with a meaningful look and whispered instructions to "Take your time, dear," Silas stood immediately. She wore a deep green dress that brought out the auburn in her hair and moved with the careful confidence of someone learning to navigate the world through senses other than sight. "Good evening, Mr. McGraw," she said as he helped her to her chair. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Not at all," he replied, though he'd been there for 20 minutes. "And please call me Silas. I think we're past formalities." "Silas, then. And I'm Annabelle." She settled into her chair and tilted her head slightly, listening to the sounds around them. "This is lovely. I can hear a piano playing somewhere. Is that coming from the hotel lobby?" "Yes, they have a musician who plays during dinner hours." Silas paused, then added carefully, "I'm sorry. I should have thought about how that might affect you." Annabelle's laugh was genuine and free of bitterness. Silas, music doesn't hurt me. If anything, it's a comfort. I may not be able to play anymore, but I can still listen and appreciate. Don't start treating me like I'm made of glass. Her directness continued to surprise him. I suppose I'm still learning how to talk to a blind woman. There's no special technique required. Just talk to me like you would anyone else. She leaned forward slightly. Though I will need you to tell me what's on the menu. I'm still working on reading Braille, and it's slow going. As Silas described the evening's offerings, he found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The way the lamplight caught the crystal glasses, the soft murmur of other diners, the scent of roasted beef and fresh bread that filled the dining room. Seeing the meal through her perspective made him more aware of the richness that surrounded them. "The beef sounds wonderful," Annabelle said. "I haven't had a proper meal since before the fire. The Whitmans are kind, but I think Mrs. Whitman is convinced I need to be fed like an invalid. Nothing but soup and soft bread. That must be frustrating." "Everything is frustrating right now," she admitted with rueful honesty. "Learning to dress myself without being able to see if colors match. Trying to pour coffee without spilling it everywhere. Walking down a street I've known for years, but now feels completely foreign." She paused. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to complain. I'm grateful to be alive and to have friends willing to help." "It's not complaining to acknowledge that your life has changed dramatically," Silas said. "I imagine most people in your situation would be feeling overwhelmed. Are you always so measured in your responses?" Annabelle asked, with a slight smile. "It's like talking to a very polite banker." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I suppose I've gotten used to being careful with my words. In business, everything you say can be taken the wrong way or used against you later. This isn't business, though. This is dinner between two people getting to know each other." She reached across the table, her fingers searching until they found his hand. "Tell me something real, Silas. Not what you think I want to hear, but something true about yourself." The touch of her hand, warm, slightly calloused from years of piano playing, sent an unexpected jolt through him. When had anyone last touched him with simple human connection rather than formal handshakes or polite gestures? "Something real," he repeated, then found himself speaking before he could second-guess the wisdom of honesty. "I've been lonely for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like until I met you. I built everything I thought I wanted, and then realized I'd built a very beautiful prison." Annabelle's fingers tightened slightly around his. "That sounds like a terrible way to live." "I didn't realize how terrible until I started having conversations with someone who actually listens to what I'm saying rather than calculating what they can gain from." "Is that what most conversations are like for you?" Silas considered this as their dinner arrived. The waitress, clearly curious about the unusual pairing but too professional to stare openly, served them efficiently before retreating to a respectful distance. "Yes," he said finally. "Every conversation is either about business or about what people think I can do for them. Even my friendships have an element of that. Murphy, Jake, and Pete are good men, but they still approach me as someone who can solve problems with money. That sounds exhausting." "It is." He cut into his beef, surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. "What about you? What were your days like before everything changed?" Annabelle smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely relaxed. "Chaotic in the best possible way. I had students from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, children learning their scales, teenagers working through complicated pieces, adults who'd always wanted to play piano, but never had the opportunity." She paused to taste her meal, closing her eyes to better appreciate the flavors. "My house was never quiet. There was always someone practicing, someone frustrated with a difficult passage, someone discovering they could make something beautiful with their hands. You miss it, desperately. Teaching music isn't just a job, it's watching people discover parts of themselves they didn't know existed." Seeing a child's face when they finally master a piece they've been struggling with, or hearing an adult play a song that means something special to them. Her voice grew wistful. I suppose I miss feeling useful more than anything else. You could teach again, Silas said. There's no reason you couldn't continue with students, is there? Where? I don't have a piano, don't have a home, don't even have a way to support myself while I rebuild. She shook her head. I'm trying to be practical about my situation, Silas. I can't just wish myself back to where I was. What if you didn't have to wish? The words came out before Silas could consider them fully. What if someone wanted to help you rebuild? Annabelle set down her fork and turned her attention fully to him, even though she couldn't see his expression. Silas, if you're offering charity, I'm not offering charity. He wasn't entirely sure what he was offering, but he knew it wasn't that. I'm suggesting that maybe we could help each other. How would I be helping you? By giving me something to do that actually matters. By letting me use what I have to create something meaningful instead of just accumulating more of what I already have too much of. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Silas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of words hanging in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed or burned. What exactly are you proposing? Annabelle asked finally. Silas took a deep breath, stepping into territory he'd never navigated before, the place where wealth met genuine caring, where practical solutions intertwined with the beginning of something that might eventually become love. I'm proposing, Silas said slowly, working through the idea as he spoke, that you let me help you start a music school, not as charity, but as a business partnership. You provide the expertise and teaching ability, I provide the resources and space. Annabelle sat perfectly still for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her water glass. A music school. There's a building in town that's been empty for 2 years, the old Presbyterian church. It has good acoustics, plenty of space for multiple students, and it's centrally located. I could purchase it, have it renovated to suit your needs. Silas found himself warming to the idea as he spoke. You could teach students of all ages, maybe even host recitals and community concerts. And what would you get out of this arrangement? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Silas considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty might reveal more than he was prepared to share. I'd get to see something worthwhile built instead of just adding another property to my portfolio, he said finally. I'd get to watch you do what you love, instead of seeing someone with your talents waste away in a guest bedroom because life dealt you an unfair hand. That sounds dangerously close to charity. It's not charity if we're both getting something we need. Silas leaned forward. Annabelle, I've been making money for 40 years. I could make money in my sleep at this point. But I haven't built anything that matters, anything that makes people's lives better. You could change that. Annabelle was quiet for so long that Silas began to worry he'd overstepped, pushed too hard too soon. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. You barely know me, Silas. How do you know I'm even a good teacher? How do you know this isn't just pity for the poor blind woman you met at Murphy's saloon? Because I've been listening to you talk about music and teaching, and your voice comes alive in a way that has nothing to do with pity or charity. Because when you describe working with students, you sound like someone who's found their calling in life. He paused. And because Murphy told me something interesting when I asked him about you. What's that? He said that after the fire, when people were trying to figure out how to help you, 3 different families offered to take you in permanently. But you insisted on staying with the Whitmans on a temporary basis only, and you've been looking for work since the day you could get around on your own. That doesn't sound like someone looking for a handout. It sounds like someone who doesn't want to be a burden. It sounds like someone with pride and independence who's been knocked down by circumstances beyond her control. Silas signaled for coffee, giving them both a moment to process the conversation. I'm not offering to rescue you, Annabelle. I'm offering to invest in something worthwhile. When the coffee arrived, Annabelle wrapped her hands around the cup, seeming to draw comfort from its warmth. There would need to be conditions, such as, "I'd want to pay you back, maybe not immediately, but eventually. This would be a loan, not a gift." Agreed. "And I'd want full control over the teaching methods, curriculum, and day-to-day operations. You might be providing the building, but I won't have someone looking over my shoulder trying to run my school." Also agreed. Silas found her terms reasonable and her insistence on maintaining control reassuring rather than off-putting. "And we keep this arrangement strictly professional. Whatever might be developing between us personally stays separate from any business partnership." This condition gave Silas pause. "Is that what you want?" "It's what I need," Annabelle said firmly. "I've already lost my independence once. I won't risk losing it again by confusing business with personal feelings. And if the personal feelings become too strong to ignore," Annabelle's hand trembled slightly around her coffee cup, "then we'll deal with that when it happens. But for now, I need to know that I can build something on my own merit, not because someone cares about me." The distinction was important to her, Silas realized. She needed to prove to herself that she could rebuild her life through her own capabilities, not through dependence on others. It was a pride he could understand and respect. "All right," he said. "Strictly professional. You agree to that rather quickly, because I understand the need to succeed on your own terms." Silas smiled. "Besides, if we're going to have personal feelings for each other, I'd rather they develop naturally than because you feel obligated to someone who's helping you." Annabelle returned his smile, though hers held a note of uncertainty. "You sound very confident that there will be personal feelings." "I'm already having them," Silas admitted. "But I'm willing to wait and see if you develop them too, without any pressure from business arrangements." The honesty of his statement seemed to surprise her. "You don't strike me as someone who admits to feelings easily." "I'm not. You seem to bring out sides of me I'd forgotten existed." They finished their dinner in comfortable conversation, discussing practical details of the proposed music school. Annabelle's knowledge of teaching methods and student needs impressed Silas with its depth and thoughtfulness. She wasn't just someone who played piano well, she was an educator who understood how to nurture musical ability in others. As they prepared to leave, Annabelle reached for her cloth bag and pulled out the salvaged piano keys. "I have one more condition." "Yes?" "I want these keys incorporated into the school somehow. A reminder that beautiful things can be rebuilt even after they've been damaged." Silas took one of the keys when she offered it, feeling the smooth ivory surface that had been blackened but not destroyed by fire. "I think that can be arranged." Walking her back to the Whitman's house, Silas found himself already imagining the old church transformed into a place of music and learning. He could see children climbing the front steps with instrument cases, hear the sound of scales and melodies drifting from the windows, picture Annabelle at the center of it all, bringing music back into her life and the lives of others. But more than that, he could see himself having a reason to visit the school, a legitimate excuse to spend time with a woman who was teaching him that wealth meant nothing if you had no one to share your dreams with. "When can we look at the building?" Annabelle asked, as they reached the Whitman's front gate. "Tomorrow, if you'd like." "I'd like that very much." As Silas watched her navigate the familiar path to the front door, he realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow for reasons that had nothing to do with business or profit. He was looking forward to seeing Annabelle's face when she heard the acoustics in the old church, to watching her begin to build something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. He was looking forward to being part of something that mattered. The old Presbyterian church stood at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its white clapboard siding weathered but solid, its tall windows catching the morning light like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Silas arrived early to meet the building inspector, wanting to have a preliminary assessment before bringing Annabelle to see the space. "Structurally sound," the inspector reported, closing his notebook with a satisfied snap. "Roof needs some work, and you'll want to update the electrical system. But the bones are good." Excellent acoustics too. These old churches were built for carrying sound. Silas walked through the empty sanctuary, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He could imagine it filled with pianos, music stands, and the voices of students discovering their musical abilities. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows painted colorful patterns on the hardwood floors, and he found himself wondering what Annabelle would think of the warm atmosphere the light would create, even if she couldn't see it. When she arrived with Mrs. Whitman, Annabelle moved carefully through the front door, then stopped just inside the sanctuary. Her head tilted as she listened to the space around her. "Say something," she requested. "What would you like me to say?" "Anything. I want to hear how your voice carries." "The inspector says the building is structurally sound," Silas called from the front of the church. "The acoustics are supposed to be excellent." Annabelle's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire demeanor. "Oh, they are. Your voice just wrapped around me like a warm blanket. The reverberation is perfect, not too much echo, but enough resonance to support singing." She moved forward, her hands outstretched to feel for obstacles. "May I explore?" "Of course. There are pews on either side, but the center aisle is clear." Watching her navigate the space was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She moved with careful deliberation, her hands mapping out the dimensions of her potential new world. When she reached the front of the church, where the pulpit had once stood, she clasped her hands together and called out, "Can you hear me clearly from back there?" "Perfectly," Silas replied. "Every word. This would be ideal for recitals," she said, more to herself than to him. "Students could perform here, and the whole community could come. Imagine children sharing music with their families in a space like this." Mrs. Whitman had remained near the entrance, clearly emotional about watching Annabelle plan for a future that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "It's beautiful, dear," she called. "Just beautiful." Over the next 2 hours, Annabelle explored every corner of the building with the thoroughness of someone planning a life, not just a business. She tested the acoustics from different positions, asked detailed questions about heating and lighting, and discussed practical considerations like student pickup and drop-off areas. "I'd want to divide the main sanctuary into practice rooms," she explained as they sat in the front pew. "Soundproofed enough that multiple students could work at the same time without interfering with each other. And I'd need at least 3 pianos, a good upright for beginners, a baby grand for advanced students, and maybe an old practice piano that children could learn on without fear of damaging something expensive." "Whatever you need," Silas said, and meant it. "You keep saying that, but you haven't heard my full vision yet." Annabelle turned to face him, her expression serious. "I don't want this to just be a music school. I want it to be a community center where music brings people together. Evening concerts, holiday recitals, maybe even a choir for adults who never had the chance to sing in a group." "That sounds wonderful. It also sounds expensive. Are you sure you're prepared for what this might cost?" Silas considered telling her that the cost was irrelevant, that he had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. Instead, he said simply, "I'm prepared to invest in something worthwhile." As they left the church, Annabelle was quiet, lost in plans and possibilities. It wasn't until they were walking back toward town that she spoke again. "Silas, why are you really doing this? I told you. You told me what you thought I needed to hear. I'm asking for the truth." They stopped walking, standing in the shade of an old oak tree that had probably watched over the town for generations. Silas found himself looking at Annabelle's face, noting the way the dappled light played across her features, wondering how to explain feelings he didn't fully understand himself. "Because I've spent 40 years building things that don't matter," he said finally. "Accumulating money and land and influence, but never creating anything that would make the world better. You've lost everything, but you're talking about rebuilding in a way that would bring joy to other people. I want to be part of that. And because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to care about something beyond profit margins and quarterly reports." You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves the respect my money has bought me." Annabelle reached out, her hand finding his arm. "That's a lot of responsibility to put on someone you've known for less than a week. I'm not asking you to change me. I'm saying you've already shown me parts of myself I'd forgotten existed." Silas covered her hand with his own. "The business partnership is separate from this, Annabelle. Whether you decide to trust me with your music school or not, I'm grateful for what you've already given me." "What's that?" "Hope that it's not too late to build something meaningful." They stood in the comfortable silence of two people, beginning to understand each other, the weight of possibility settling around them like the afternoon shadows. Finally, Annabelle spoke. "I'll need contracts drawn up. Legal documents that protect both of us and make the terms clear." "Of course. And I'll want to interview potential students myself, even if they've already been recommended by others." "Naturally. And Silas? This doesn't change what I said about keeping business separate from personal feelings. We're entering into a professional relationship." "Understood." But as they resumed walking toward town, both of them knew that the lines she was trying to draw were already blurred beyond recognition. The music school would be their shared creation, built on practical needs and sound business principles, but also on something deeper, a growing connection between two people who were discovering that the best partnerships sometimes emerged from the most unexpected circumstances. That evening, Silas sat in his study, reviewing the preliminary cost estimates his architect had provided. The numbers were substantial but not overwhelming, and as he studied the proposed floor plans, he found himself imagining sounds that had never filled his silent house: the laughter of children, the melody of practiced scales, the warm conversation of people brought together by shared love of music. For the first time in years, his money would create something beautiful. 3 weeks into the renovation of the old church, complications began to emerge that had nothing to do with construction schedules or building permits. Silas found himself visiting the worksite daily, ostensibly to check on progress, but really hoping to catch glimpses of Annabelle as she worked with the architects and contractors to bring her vision to life. "You're spending more time at that church than you do at your ranch," his foreman, Carlos Martinez, observed one morning as Silas prepared to ride into town again. "Everything all right with the cattle operation?" "Everything's fine, Carlos. The ranch practically runs itself at this point." Carlos, who had worked for Silas for 15 years and earned the right to speak plainly, raised an eyebrow. "Never known you to take such a personal interest in a business investment before." "It's an unusual investment. It's an unusual woman, from what I hear." Carlos's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "Town's talking, you know." This gave Silas pause. "Talking about what?" "About the richest man in 3 counties spending his money to help a blind piano teacher start a music school. Some folks think it's mighty generous. Others are wondering what you're expecting in return." "And what do you think?" "I think I've never seen you care about anything the way you care about this project. And I think maybe that's not entirely about charity." Silas couldn't argue with Carlos's assessment. What had started as a business proposition was becoming something far more personal, despite Annabelle's insistence on maintaining professional boundaries. Every day brought new evidence that their careful separation of business and personal feelings was an artificial construct that reality was steadily eroding. At the church, he found Annabelle working with the piano tuner, testing the 3 instruments that had been delivered the previous day. She sat at the baby grand, her fingers moving across the keys with the fluid grace of someone finding her way home after a long journey. "That middle C is still slightly flat," she told the tuner, then played a scale to demonstrate. "Can you bring it up just a touch?" Watching her work reminded Silas why he was doing this. Here was someone who had lost everything but refused to be defeated, who was rebuilding not just her own life, but creating opportunities for others to discover joy through music. The sight of her hands on the piano keys, confident, capable, creating beauty from carefully ordered sound, stirred something in him that had nothing to do with business partnerships or community improvement. "Mr. McGraw," the tuner called, noticing his arrival. "Perfect timing, Mrs. Carson wants to test the acoustics with someone listening from different parts of the room." Of course. Silas positioned himself at the back of the sanctuary while Annabelle began to play. The melody that flowed from the piano was unlike anything he'd heard before, complex but accessible, melancholy but hopeful. It seemed to capture something essential about the journey from loss to renewal. "What was that?" he asked when she finished. "Something I composed years ago. I called it After the Storm." Annabelle rose from the piano bench, her expression thoughtful. "I'd forgotten how much I missed playing for someone other than myself. You should play it at the opening recital." "We don't have an opening recital planned." "We should. The whole community should hear what you can do." Annabelle moved carefully through the space between the practice rooms that were taking shape, her hands trailing along the new walls as she familiarized herself with the layout. "Silas, there's something we need to discuss." "What's that?" "People are talking about us. Mrs. Whitman mentioned that there are rumors around town about your motivations for funding this school." Silas felt a familiar tension in his shoulders. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest you're doing this for reasons that have nothing to do with community service." Annabelle stopped walking and turned to face him. "Some people think you're trying to buy my affections. Others think I'm taking advantage of your generosity." "And what do you think?" "I think we've let this situation become more complicated than it should be." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cloth bag containing her salvaged piano keys. "I also think we need to be honest about what's happening between us." The directness of her statement caught Silas off guard, though he should have expected it by now. Annabelle had never been one to dance around difficult topics. "All right," he said. "Honesty. What's happening between us?" "You're falling in love with me." She said it matter-of-factly, without dramatics or coyness. "And I'm falling in love with you. And we're both pretending that we can keep this strictly professional when everyone in town can see that we're fooling ourselves." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, transforming everything and nothing at the same time. Silas had known it was true, but hearing Annabelle say it aloud made it real in a way that changed the entire dynamic of their relationship. "Yes," he said simply. "That's what's happening. So what do we do about it? What do you want to do about it?" Annabelle fingered the piano keys in the cloth bag, her expression troubled. "I want to finish this school. I want to prove to myself that I can build something meaningful on my own merit. And I want to see where these feelings lead without the complication of feeling indebted to you. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive, don't they? If we acknowledge that we're in love, how can I be certain that my success here is earned rather than given? How can you be certain that my feelings are genuine rather than gratitude dressed up as romance?" It was a fair question, and one that Silas had been avoiding thinking about too deeply. The power imbalance in their situation was undeniable. He had wealth and resources, she had talent and determination, but was still financially dependent on his investment. Moving from business partnership to romantic relationship would complicate everything. "So what are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting we put our personal feelings aside until the school is established and successful. Until I can stand on my own 2 feet as a business owner rather than as someone you're helping. And how long might that take? I don't know. 6 months? A year? However long it takes for me to prove that I can make this work." Silas considered this proposal, understanding her reasoning but feeling a deep reluctance to put their relationship on hold when it was just beginning to develop. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, we're business partners. Nothing more." Annabelle's smile was sad but determined. "I've learned to do a lot of things I didn't think were possible. I suppose I can learn to do this too." As Silas watched her return to working with the contractors, he realized that loving Annabelle meant respecting her need for independence, even when it meant denying himself what he wanted most. It also meant that the next few months were going to be the most difficult of his life. The letter arrived On a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks before the music school's planned opening, Mrs. Whitman brought it to Annabelle at the church, where she was conducting final sound tests in the newly completed practice rooms. The envelope bore the letterhead of a prestigious law firm from Austin, and the return address made Mrs. Whitman's hands tremble as she described it. Carson versus Northern Pacific Insurance Company, she read aloud. Annabelle, dear, this looks important. Annabelle set down the tuning fork she'd been using and accepted the envelope with careful fingers. Would you mind reading it to me? Legal documents are still beyond my braille skills. Mrs. Whitman's voice grew stronger as she read, though surprise colored every word. Dear Mrs. Carson, we are pleased to inform you that the lawsuit filed on your behalf against Northern Pacific Insurance Company has been settled in your favor. The company has agreed to pay damages in the amount of $127,000 for their wrongful denial of your fire insurance claim, plus an additional $23,000 in legal fees and costs. As you may recall, your case was taken on contingency by our firm after the insurance company claimed that the fire which destroyed your home was the result of negligence on your part. Our investigation proved conclusively that the fire was caused by faulty electrical wiring installed by contractors working for the previous homeowner, making you eligible for full coverage under your policy. We understand that this settlement comes after considerable hardship, but we hope it will enable you to rebuild your life and career. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for the transfer of funds. The silence that followed was so complete that Annabelle could hear the sound of hammers from the construction work happening in the next room. Mrs. Whitman had stopped reading, apparently as stunned by the contents of the letter as Annabelle was. $127,000, Annabelle said slowly, as if testing the reality of the words. Plus $23,000 in fees, Mrs. Whitman added. Annabelle, this changes everything. It did change everything, in ways that reached far beyond the obvious relief of financial security. The money meant independence, the ability to pay Silas back for his investment in the music school, to stand on equal footing in their business relationship, to move forward without the complicated dynamics of gratitude and obligation that had colored every interaction between them. It also meant that the careful boundaries she'd drawn to protect her heart and her pride were no longer necessary. I need to find Silas, Annabelle said, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. He needs to know about this. She found him at his ranch, reviewing cattle inventories with Carlos in the main barn. When Carlos saw her approaching with Mrs. Whitman, he discreetly excused himself, clearly sensing that whatever brought the ladies out to the ranch was private business. Annabelle, Silas said, concern evident in his voice as he moved to greet her. Is everything all right? Has something happened at the school? Something has happened, she said, but not at the school. Silas, I need to tell you something that changes our entire arrangement. She explained about the letter, about the lawsuit she'd forgotten in the trauma of losing her sight and her home, about the insurance company that had finally been forced to honor their obligations. Silas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. This is wonderful news, he said when she finished. You can rebuild completely now, start fresh, without depending on anyone else's help. Yes, I can. Which means I can pay you back immediately for everything you've invested in the music school. Annabelle, that's not necessary. It's absolutely necessary. Her voice carried the determination that had gotten her through the worst period of her life. I told you I wanted this to be a loan, not a gift. Now I can make good on that promise. And then what happens? Then I own my music school outright, free and clear. Then we're no longer business partners with unequal investments. Then, she paused, suddenly uncertain about the words that wanted to come next. Then what? Silas asked, gently. Then we can see what might develop between us without all the complications that have been in the way. They stood in the shadowy coolness of the barn, surrounded by the familiar sounds and scents of ranch life. both of them recognizing that this moment represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. The careful protocols they'd established, the professional boundaries that had governed their interactions, the elaborate dance of attraction tempered by practical concerns, all of it was suddenly irrelevant. "There's something else," Annabelle said, reaching into her pocket for the cloth bag that never left her side. She pulled out one of the charred piano keys, turning it over in her fingers. "The lawyer said something interesting about the timing of this settlement." "What's that?" "He said the insurance company had been fighting the case for months, but they suddenly decided to settle last week. He couldn't explain why, said it was unusual for them to capitulate so quickly after stonewalling for so long." Silas was quiet for a moment too long, and Annabelle's head tilted in the way it did when she was listening to something beyond words. "Silas," she said carefully, "you wouldn't happen to know anything about why Northern Pacific Insurance suddenly decided to honor my claim, would you?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of secrets and good intentions. Finally, Silas spoke. "I might have had my lawyers contact them, pointed out some legal precedents they might not have been aware of, suggested that fighting the case might not be in their best interests. You intervened in my lawsuit. I made some phone calls, without telling me. I knew you wouldn't want me to interfere, but I also knew you deserved that money. The fire wasn't your fault, and they had no right to deny your claim." Annabelle turned the piano key over and over in her hands, processing this revelation. "How long have you known about the lawsuit?" "Since the first week we met. I had my lawyers look into your situation just to see if there was anything that could be done. You've been manipulating this from the beginning. I've been helping from the beginning. There's a difference. Is there?" Annabelle's voice carried a note of hurt that cut through Silas more sharply than anger would have. "You let me believe that I was rebuilding my independence, that I was creating something on my own merit. But you've been pulling strings behind the scenes, managing my life like one of your business investments. That's not how it was. Then how was it, Silas? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been playing a game where you know all the rules and I know none of them." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Silas had convinced himself that his interventions were justified, that helping Annabelle succeed was an act of love rather than control. But hearing her describe it as manipulation made him see his actions from an entirely different perspective. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have told you. I should have asked your permission before involving myself in your legal affairs. Yes, you should have. I was afraid you'd refuse to let me help, and I couldn't stand the thought of you suffering when I had the power to change things. So you decided for me. You took away my choice." Annabelle carefully tucked the piano key back into its cloth bag, the gesture somehow final. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but distant. "I need some time to think about this. About what it means for the music school, for our business arrangement, for everything. Annabelle, please don't let this change what's developing between us. What's developing between us was built on a foundation that apparently wasn't real. You've been the puppet master, and I've been the grateful puppet dancing to strings I couldn't see. That's not fair, isn't it?" She turned to face him, and even though she couldn't see his expression, her words found their mark with devastating accuracy. "You said you wanted to help me because you'd never built anything meaningful. But you weren't helping me build something, you were building something yourself and letting me think I was part of it." As Mrs. Whitman helped her back to the buggy, Silas stood in the barn doorway watching the woman he loved drive away, carrying with her the independence he'd tried to give her and the trust he'd apparently lost in the process of trying to help. For 3 days, Silas heard nothing from Annabelle. The silence stretched like a physical weight across his chest, made heavier by the knowledge that he had caused it through his own misguided attempts to help. He threw himself into ranch work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his thoughts, but even the most demanding tasks couldn't quiet the voice in his head that kept replaying their last conversation. You've been pacing like a caged wolf, Carlos observed on Thursday morning, finding Silas checking the same fence line for the third time in 2 days. Maybe it's time to stop hiding out here and deal with whatever's eating at you. I'm not hiding. No? Then what do you call spending 3 days doing work that any of the hands could handle while avoiding town like it's got the plague? Silas couldn't argue with the assessment. He had been avoiding town, avoiding the possibility of seeing Annabelle before she was ready to see him, avoiding the curious stares of people who knew something had gone wrong between them. I made a mistake, Carlos. A big one. With the piano teacher? I thought I was helping her, but I was really just trying to control things, trying to make sure everything worked out the way I thought it should. Carlos removed his hat and wiped his forehead with a bandana, considering this confession. You know what your problem is, boss? What's that? You've been rich and powerful for so long that you forgot what it's like to not be able to fix everything with money and influence. But some things, the important things, they don't work that way. I know that now. Do you? Because knowing something and understanding it deep in your bones are two different things. Carlos gestured toward the direction of town. That woman doesn't need you to solve her problems. She needs you to trust her to solve them herself and be there to celebrate when she does. The truth of the observation hit Silas like a physical blow. In trying to ensure Annabelle's success, he had robbed her of the satisfaction of achieving it herself. He had treated her like a project to be managed rather than a partner to be supported. That afternoon, Murphy appeared at the ranch, arriving unannounced and wearing the expression of a man on a mission. We need to talk, he said without preamble. They sat on the front porch, watching the late afternoon sun paint the pastures gold, while Murphy delivered what amounted to a verbal reckoning. Jake and Pete and I have been friends with you for 20 years, Murphy began. We've watched you build an empire, watched you succeed at everything you put your mind to, and we've been proud to know you. But right now, we're also disappointed. In you. I suppose I deserve that. You suppose? Silas, you took a woman who'd lost everything and was fighting to rebuild her independence, and you turned her into another one of your business deals. You managed her life like she was a prize heifer you were preparing for auction. The harsh words stung because they were accurate. I was trying to help her. No, you were trying to control the outcome. There's a difference. Murphy leaned forward in his chair. Annabelle Carson is the strongest woman I've ever met. She survived losing her sight, her home, and her livelihood, and she was finding her way back to a meaningful life through sheer determination. She didn't need you to orchestrate her success. She needed you to believe in her ability to create it herself. I did believe in her. Then why didn't you trust her enough to let her fight her own battles? Silas had no answer for that, because the question struck at the heart of his failure. He had claimed to admire Annabelle's strength and independence, while simultaneously undermining both through his secret interventions. She's going to open the music school, Murphy continued. Paid you back every penny yesterday, according to my sources at the bank. The whole town's talking about how she walked in there with a check that cleared her debt completely. Good. She should be free of any obligation to me. But she's not free of her feelings for you, and you're not free of yours for her. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? I betrayed her trust. She has every right to want nothing more to do with me. Maybe, but there's something else you should know. Murphy pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. This is an invitation to the opening recital for the Redemption Ridge Community Music School. It's being held next Saturday evening. Silas accepted the invitation, noting the elegant script that he recognized as Annabelle's handwriting, probably painstakingly created with the help of a writing guide. She sent this to me? She sent it to everyone in town, including you. Murphy stood to leave. The way I see it, you have until next Saturday to figure out how to apologize to a woman who deserves better than excuses and explanations. You need to find a way to show her that you understand what you did wrong and that you're committed to being the kind of man who deserves her trust. After Murphy left, Silas sat on the porch until full darkness fell, studying the invitation by lamplight. The recital would feature student performances and, according to the program notes, a special presentation by Mrs. Annabelle Carson. He imagined her at the piano, sharing her music with the community that had embraced her, creating the kind of meaningful moment he had claimed to want to be part of. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was achieving everything they had planned together, but she was doing it without him. Over the following days, Silas found himself reconsidering every aspect of his relationship with Annabelle, examining his motivations with a honesty that was both painful and necessary. He had told himself that he was helping her, but the truth was more complex and less flattering. He had been trying to create a story where he was the hero who rescued the worthy woman from her circumstances. He had wanted to be essential to her success, to be the reason she was able to rebuild her life. It was a narrative that made him feel good about himself while robbing Annabelle of agency in her own story. The realization led to another, even more uncomfortable truth. He had fallen in love with an idealized version of Annabelle, the grateful woman who needed his help, rather than the real woman who was strong enough to rebuild her life, with or without him. On Friday evening, the night before the recital, Silas made a decision that went against every instinct that had governed his business life for 40 years. Instead of developing a strategy or planning his approach, he simply walked to town and stood outside the music school, listening to the sounds of final preparations drifting through the windows. He could hear Annabelle's voice directing the setup, the sound of piano scales being practiced, the excited chatter of children preparing for their first public performance. The building he had helped purchase was alive with exactly the kind of meaningful activity he had claimed to want to support. But he was outside, looking in, and that was exactly where he belonged until he could prove that he understood the difference between supporting someone's dreams and trying to control them. As he walked back to his ranch, Silas began to formulate not a plan, but a commitment, a way to demonstrate that he had learned the lesson Annabelle's silence had been trying to teach him. Tomorrow night's recital would be her triumph, achieved entirely through her own efforts and abilities. If he attended, it would be as a member of the community celebrating her success, not as someone claiming credit for making it possible. And if she was willing to give him another chance, not to be her rescuer, but to be her equal partner in whatever came next, he would spend the rest of his life proving that he understood the difference. The pocket watch in his vest continued its steady rhythm as he walked through the darkness, marking time that he hoped might finally be spent building something real, with someone who didn't need him to fix her life, but might choose to share it with him anyway. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for new beginnings, clear skies, gentle breeze, and the golden light of late summer that made everything appear touched by magic. By 6 o'clock, an hour before the recital was scheduled to begin, carriages and wagons were already gathering outside the Redemption Ridge Community Music School. Silas arrived on foot, having left his horse at the Blouk's livery stable, rather than calling attention to himself with the elaborate carriage that usually announced his presence at community events. He wore his best suit, but carried himself with the careful humility of a man who understood he was attending someone else's triumph. Inside the transformed church, he barely recognized the space he had helped purchase. Annabelle had arranged the seating to create an intimate concert hall, with the piano positioned where the altar had once stood. Candles in glass holders provided warm lighting that made the stained glass windows glow like jewels, and fresh flowers, clearly contributed by various community members, added color and fragrance to the evening. "Silas," Murphy's voice carried a note of surprise as he appeared at Silas's elbow. "Wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. What changed your mind?" "I realized that this isn't about me. It's about celebrating what Annabelle has accomplished." Murphy nodded approvingly. "That's the wisest thing you've said in weeks." The sanctuary filled quickly with families, elderly couples, and young people who had heard about the new music school. Silas chose a seat near the back, close enough to see and hear everything but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to his presence. At precisely 7 o'clock, Annabelle emerged from what had once been the vestry, now converted into a preparation room for performers. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks learning every inch of the space. In her hands, she carried a single charred piano key, one of the artifacts she had saved from the fire. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics. "Welcome to the first recital of the Redemption Ridge Community Music School." A warm murmur of applause greeted her words, and Silas felt his chest tighten with pride and regret in equal measure. This was the moment she had been working toward, the culmination of her determination to rebuild not just her own life, but to create something meaningful for others. "Before we begin tonight's performances," Annabelle continued, "I want to share something with you. 6 months ago, I lost my home, my sight, and what I thought was my future in a terrible fire. I was angry, frightened, and convinced that everything meaningful in my life was over." She held up the charred piano key, turning it so that the candlelight caught its blackened surface. "This is one of the few things I managed to save from that fire. For a long time, I saw it as a reminder of everything I had lost. But tonight, I want to share a different perspective." Silas found himself leaning forward, drawn by the quiet authority in her voice and the way she commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "This key can no longer make music in the way it was originally designed to do," Annabelle said, "but it has become something else, a symbol of survival, of the possibility that something beautiful can emerge from even the most devastating circumstances. Tonight, as you listen to the music created by our students, I want you to remember that every beautiful thing in life is built on a foundation that includes both joy and sorrow, triumph and failure." She moved to the piano with the fluid grace that had always characterized her movements, settling onto the bench as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. "The first piece tonight will be a composition I wrote during the darkest period of my recovery. I called it After the Storm, and it represents my belief that hope is not the absence of hardship, but the decision to create beauty in spite of it." As her fingers touched the keys, the first notes filled the sanctuary with a melody that was both haunting and hopeful. Silas recognized it from the day she had tested the piano's acoustics, but hearing it now, in this context, surrounded by the community that had embraced her vision, gave it an entirely different meaning. The music spoke of loss and recovery, of darkness giving way to light, of the slow, difficult process of rebuilding not just a life, but faith in the possibility of joy. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her journey, from despair to this moment of triumph. Silas found tears in his eyes as he listened, not just because the music was beautiful, but because he understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary, the transformation of tragedy into art, of personal pain into community celebration. This was what he had claimed to want to be part of, but Annabelle had achieved it entirely through her own strength and vision. The student performances that followed Annabelle's opening piece were a testament to her teaching abilities and the hunger for music that existed in Redemption Ridge. 8-year-old Sarah Whitman played a simple but heartfelt rendition of "Mary Had a Little Lamb," her small fingers finding each note with careful precision while her grandmother wiped away proud tears. Teenage brothers performed a duet they had learned in just 6 weeks of lessons, their voices blending in harmony that filled the sanctuary with pure, unadorned joy. Each performance drew enthusiastic applause from the audience, but Silas found himself watching Annabelle more than the students. She stood beside the piano during each piece, her face glowing with the satisfaction of watching her students succeed. This was what she had meant when she talked about feeling useful, not just creating music herself, but nurturing the musical abilities of others. As the evening progressed, Silas became aware of something unexpected happening in the audience around him. People were not just politely attending a community event, they were genuinely moved by what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson, the stern elderly woman who ran the general store, was humming along with one of the melodies. The Henderson family, who rarely attended any social gatherings, had brought all 5 of their children and were beaming with pride as their youngest daughter performed her first piano solo. During intermission, as people mingled and congratulated the performers, Silas overheard conversations that revealed the deeper impact of Annabelle's music school. "Tommy's been practicing every day since he started lessons," one mother told another. "I haven't seen him this excited about learning since, well, maybe ever. And the cost is so reasonable," added a third woman. Mrs. Carson said she wants music to be available to everyone, not just families with money to spare. This casual comment struck Silas with particular force. Annabelle had made her lessons affordable for the entire community, which meant she was earning significantly less than she could have charged. She was prioritizing access over profit, community benefit over personal gain, the kind of principled decision that required both generosity and confidence in her own abilities. When the intermission ended, Annabelle returned to the piano for what the program listed as special selection. She settled onto the bench and spoke directly to the audience with an intimacy that made the large space feel like a gathering of close friends. "This final piece is something I composed this week," she said. "It's called Finding Home, and it's dedicated to everyone who helped me discover that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a community of people who believe in the same things you do." As she began to play, Silas immediately understood that this composition was different from After the Storm. Where the earlier piece had been about surviving tragedy, this new music was about the joy of belonging, the satisfaction of contributing something meaningful, the deep contentment that came from finding one's place in the world. The melody was complex but accessible, weaving together themes that seemed to represent different voices in a community, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes creating gentle tension, but always returning to a central melody that bound everything together. It was sophisticated music that revealed the depth of Annabelle's talent while remaining emotionally accessible to everyone in the room. As the final notes faded into silence, the audience sat in the kind of reverent quiet that followed truly exceptional performances. Then, as if moved by a collective impulse, they rose to their feet in applause that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere appreciation. It was recognition of something extraordinary they had just witnessed. Silas found himself standing with everyone else, clapping until his hands hurt, but his attention was focused entirely on Annabelle's face. She looked radiant, not with the glow of someone basking in praise, but with the deep satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. As the applause finally died down and people began to gather their belongings, several community members approached Annabelle to congratulate her and discuss enrolling additional family members in lessons. Silas watched from his position near the back of the sanctuary, recognizing that this was her moment, her triumph, achieved entirely through her own vision and effort. He was preparing to leave quietly, to allow her to enjoy her success without the complication of his presence, when he heard his name called, "Mr. McGraw." It was young Sarah Whitman, the 8-year-old who had performed the evening's opening student piece. "Mrs. Carson wants to see you." Silas looked toward the front of the sanctuary, where Annabelle stood surrounded by well-wishers. Even from this distance, even though she couldn't see him, she had somehow sensed his presence. "She said to tell you that she has something she wants to say to you," Sarah continued with the serious delivery of a child, entrusted with an important message. "She said it's important." As Silas made his way through the dispersing crowd toward the woman who had transformed not just an old church, but an entire community's relationship with music, he realized that whatever Annabelle wanted to say to him would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the kind of man he would choose to be going forward. The sanctuary had mostly emptied by the time Silas reached Annabelle. The last few families were gathering their things and saying goodbyes, their voices creating a warm murmur of conversation that spoke of an evening well spent. She stood near the piano, her hands resting on the bench, waiting for him with the patient stillness that had become so familiar to him. "Annabelle," he said softly as he approached, "that was extraordinary. What you've created here—" "Thank you," she interrupted gently, "but that's not what I wanted to talk to you about." She moved toward the front pew and sat down, patting the space beside her in invitation. Silas settled next to her, acutely aware of the space between them and the weight of everything that remained unsaid. "I've been thinking about what happened between us," Annabelle began, her voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had rehearsed these words. "About your involvement in my insurance case, about the help you provided, about the way everything unfolded." Silas remained silent, understanding that this was her moment to speak and his to listen. "I was angry," she continued, "because I felt like you had robbed me of the satisfaction of succeeding on my own. I felt manipulated, controlled, reduced to another one of your projects that needed managing. You had every right to feel that way. Maybe, but I've also been thinking about something else." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the cloth bag containing her salvaged piano keys. "These keys represent something important to me, the idea that beautiful things can survive even devastating circumstances. But tonight, playing for this community, watching children discover music, seeing families come together around something meaningful, tonight, I realized something." She pulled out one of the charred keys, turning it over in her fingers. "This key can't make music anymore, not the way it was designed to. But it's still part of something beautiful because it reminds me where I came from and how far I've traveled. Your help, even the parts I didn't know about, might be like that too." Silas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the guilt and regret he'd been carrying for weeks. "I don't need to have accomplished everything completely on my own for it to be meaningful," Annabelle said. "I just needed to know that my success was real, that it was based on my abilities and not just your generosity. Tonight proved that to me. This music school exists because I can teach, because I can inspire students, because I can create something valuable for this community." "You proved that completely," Silas said. "What I saw tonight had nothing to do with money or buildings or business arrangements. It was pure talent and dedication." "Yes, it was. And that means I can stop being afraid that my feelings for you are based on gratitude rather than genuine affection." She turned to face him, though she couldn't see his expression. "Because they're not based on gratitude, Silas. They're based on the fact that you're a man who sees problems and wants to fix them, who has resources and wants to use them for good, who claimed to love me when I had nothing to offer in return. You had everything to offer. I know that now. But it took tonight, seeing what I could accomplish, to really believe it." Annabelle smiled, and it was like watching the sun emerge from behind clouds. "So, I have a question for you." "What's that?" "Are you still interested in building something meaningful? Not as my benefactor or my business partner, but as someone who might want to share a life with me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Silas felt the weight of his father's pocket watch in his vest, the timepiece that had reminded him for so long that time spent with loved ones was never wasted. For 40 years, he had been too busy accumulating wealth to spend time on love. But sitting here with Annabelle, surrounded by the evidence of what they had created together, not the building or the pianos, but the music and community and hope, he understood that he had finally found something worth investing his time in. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he said. "I've been used to controlling situations for so long that learning to be a partner instead of a manager might take some practice. I can't promise I won't be stubbornly independent sometimes," Annabelle replied. "I've learned to stand on my own, and I don't ever want to lose that ability. So we'll both have to learn as we go. I suppose we will." She reached for his hand, and when he took hers, he felt the calluses from years of piano playing, the strength that had gotten her through the worst period of her life, the gentleness that had inspired tonight's beautiful performance. "But I think we're both worth the effort, don't you?" Silas brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I think we're worth everything." As they sat together in the sanctuary that had become a symbol of second chances and new beginnings, the last of the evening light faded from the stained glass windows. Soon, the space would be dark, except for the few candles still flickering at the piano. But neither of them was in any hurry to leave. They had found their way to each other through loss and loneliness, through misunderstandings and wounded pride, through the complicated dance of two people learning to trust each other with their hearts. The music school would continue to thrive, bringing joy and learning to the Redemption Ridge community. The insurance settlement would provide security and independence. The business partnership had evolved into something deeper and more lasting. But more than any of that, two people who had forgotten how to hope for love had discovered that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to build something beautiful together, never too late for the kind of happiness that came not from having everything, but from sharing whatever you had with someone who understood its true value. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the end of one story and the beginning of another.